Shouting fire in a crowded theatre, a scenario often brought out to demonstrate the limits of free speech. However, there's actually nothing wrong with shouting fire in a crowded theatre. The issue is the panic you cause, and in fact, if you inform people beforehand, or just assemble people so that you can shout fire in a crowded theatre, there's no problem, is there? I don't know why you would, but you could, and there would be no problem with you shouting fire in a crowded theatre. Now, fire is something that is pretty universally terrifying for people unless you're a psychopath and do not feel fear. If people and the buildings they make are not susceptible to fire, what would the reaction be if you went in and shouted fire? Probably about the same as if you went in and shouted squirrels. People might get annoyed and think you're a bit nuts, but there would be no panic. Like I said, fire is a good example though, because it is objectively dangerous. It will kill you, it will destroy what you have. It harms all humans, so it makes sense for all humans to fear it. And it makes sense that you should be penalized for trying to scare people with it, because you're doing something beyond expression. Because it's a universal danger, you have to be careful with it. Just like threatening people. You could say to a mate, oh, I'm gonna threaten you, and then threaten them and it's a joke. If you say to some random person, I am going to kill you, you've done something beyond expressing yourself. It's reasonable for a human to fear being told they're going to be killed by someone who could kill them. But really, it is down to the person being talked to the person being spoken at, because if you were immortal, you wouldn't fear a death threat. Humans do, so it makes sense for that to be limited speech, limited expression, because it's not expression, it's an act. You are trying to terrorize people. This idea is something people try to exploit though, because people can have their own idiosyncratic fears that are not reasonable for the majority of mankind to hold. People even have extreme phobias of, say, feathers. This means that, for them, someone shouting feathers in a theatre might cause them to panic and try and trample over people. Perhaps that isn't the most realistic scenario. Some people have the same sort of reaction you might have to someone screaming fire to certain ideas, to the point of actually providing safe spaces against these ideas, bunkers as if it were some actual physical assault on them, as if saying these ideas were the same as someone shouting fire, requiring you to find a place where you would be safe from the flames. What do we do when enough people react this way to these ideas that is the same as screaming fire in a crowded theatre when there is no fire? In fact, in this situation, there can be no fire. These ideas do not represent an actual danger, and yet, if enough people adopt the stance that it's something to freak out about and actually hide against in a physical sense, they will become dangerous because of people's reaction to them. I personally believe we have a responsibility to restrict free speech as little as possible. I also believe that these safe spaces are a strategy to try to restrict free speech by turning innocuous statements into the equivalent of, like I've been repeating, shouting fire in a crowded theatre. I think restrictions on what you can say should be based purely on shared human dangers, like fire, like death threats, things like that can cause panic reasonably to any given individual human. And even those thoughts, when demarcated as expression, are not something you can't say. If you have some sort of art piece where you fill a theatre with people and shout fire, that's fine, because you aren't going to cause panic because people are aware. To turn certain ideas or ways of looking at the world into something that is seen as a danger, something that can cause people to panic, to deliberately do that, which is what you are doing with safe spaces. You are sensitizing people to these things that they should not be sensitized to. You are manufacturing a symptom that needs curing. People being traumatized by things. How do you fix that? You can't be having people traumatized, so you get rid of what the cause of it, these ideas. I think you have a responsibility not to react like that. It's like, instead of turning down an invitation to something, you take the invitation and show up in a tank or a safety suit to show everyone how toxic the other person is as a show. Just don't go to speeches. Otherwise, you are trying to enact censorship. You are trying to paint it as an actual danger. You are trying to say, this goes beyond speech and this is an action that hurts me. And if enough people show that, maybe people will step in. You have the ability to allow or disallow free speech. And I believe you have the responsibility to, if possible, not lead to its restriction. Not liking someone's views on feminism is not in the same league as being afraid of fucking fire. And yet, they're putting it there by having these safe rooms. They're creating the appearance of justified censorship because these words go beyond speech and are an action, just like, as I've repeated so many times, shouting fire in a crowded theatre. However, you could say this is relatively easy to just brush off and ignore and mock. What I'm going to argue though is that this is one step in the direction of something much worse. When you have people isolated from certain ideas, they become very sensitized to it to the point where it does cause a reaction of shouting fire in them because they have never been exposed to it. I'm someone who used to deal with extreme social anxiety, and the way you get over that is exposure. If I had stayed in all the time, I would have had extreme reactions to going out for my whole life, and they would have gotten worse. The same is true when being faced with certain ideas, as I know from my sister who has severe OCD. I'm going to take you on what might seem like a tangent, but it will come back to this, I promise. When is violence justified? Because it is sometimes, I believe. Of course, there's the obvious example of sport or, other consensual minor violences. But also, in self-defense, it may not be ideal, but it may be justified, and it may be what you need to do to protect yourself. To simplify, violence can justify violence as a means of stopping the original violence. With regard to what I've been talking about, this can be a huge problem. There are people sensitizing themselves and being sensitized to ideas so strongly that they would classify them as being violence. And I'm not talking about making threats. That makes sense. I'd say that is an act of violence because it makes sense as part of our shared human experience to have that classified as an act of violence. I am talking about criticism, mockery, ideas people just don't like. And what happens when something is violence? It justifies a violent response, actual physical harm. If speech really is violence, I think that justifies a violent response. If someone holds a knife up to you and says, "I'm going to stab you," and you take them down, I think that's reasonable, even though they haven't actually stabbed you. People are trying to put thoughts and ideas on that same level as threatening someone. Some, as you can see on the screen, are doing it explicitly. Others, however, are doing it implicitly, and I believe that's an effect of safe spaces. Or at least safe spaces as they're meant in terms of universities where people can go hide out and bunker themselves up against speech. They're responding to it as if it were violence, and I believe when you paint your enemies as violent, you justify violence against them. Yes, you might be weak, it might not be your fault, and might doesn't make right, but nor does weakness. And you still have a responsibility not to do this to other people. You can just not go to these speeches, you can ignore them. You don't need to make a spectacle to paint them as some aggressor. And I believe you are putting free speech in danger, and I believe you are putting human beings in danger with these theatrical safe spaces. Engage with the things that offend you. Criticize them, mock them, hold your own counter events. Don't propagandize like this. I mean, I can't and I won't stop you from doing it, but if you paint the picture of you taking real harm from something, people are going to feel justified in stopping it with real harm. If you paint yourself as a victim when you aren't really, you also painted someone as a villain. If anything happens to them, I put that on you. You're the ones shouting fire at feminists. But as usual, that's just another one of my harmful opinions.